Welcome in the latest episode of that SEC podcast. I'm your host, Michael Bratton. I go by SEC Mike on Twitter, and it is an SEC After Dark. So that means that is Stephen Lassan, senior editor over at Athlon Sports. Stephen, how you doing, my friend?
Mike, I think the SEC After Dark magic got us after last week. Last week's show was cursed with injuries. And then, of course, over the last couple of days, I've been battling an illness. So we're off to a good start here as we get closer to the season. We're supposed to be ramping up, right? We're not supposed to be trending in the wrong direction. But here I am on the injury list.
We are not in camp mode here, just for the folks to know. Stephen's sick as a dog. I threw my back out. We almost didn't do this show, but we're powering through because football's right around the corner. And as miserable as things may be for Stephen and I at the current moment, the only thing that is getting us through all this is football is right around the corner. So we didn't want to leave y'all hanging, but ready to talk some SEC football. Stephen came up with another outstanding show topic for today. We're going to talk about the best players on every single SEC team. Before, at the end, we're going to kind of recap it and go the top 25 players in all the SEC. And thankfully, Stephen, this ain't ACC, this ain't Big 12, this ain't Pac-12, which I think is Pac-2 now, whatever. But because there's actually elite players to discuss, and this was not easy to do.
Oh, man, it is hard to do a top five for some of these SEC teams, looking at you, Georgia, especially. And some of these teams in the SEC, I think, Mike, I think one of the interesting things about doing this is it sort of helps you get an idea of like team strength almost. Like when you get to a team and you have a hard time figuring out who is number one on that list, it's probably not a good sign. You could also look at it as, hey, I don't know who's number one because they have a bunch of good players. And there were some teams that it was a hard exercise to get five on there. But I think just kind of in the big picture sense, this league is overwhelming with talent at quarterback. Along the defensive line, there are some standouts. Obviously offensive linemen in this league this year. I think when we get to the top 25 list at the end, I think there's an interesting position that is not represented at all in the top 25 that normally would be. So some intrigue for later on.
Right. So again, we're gonna hit on all 16 SEC teams, and then we're gonna recap with the top 25 players overall. But one thing I wanted to hit you up with, Stephen, just as people are filtering in here, we talked on this last episode, Shane and I, but just want to throw it your way because I'm sure you're aware of it. But when you see it written down, and I believe I have it still here that I could pull up. Yeah, this is via Brett McMurphy here. Outstanding job. Covered college football for a long time. But he said, Godspeed, number one, Georgia. 18 of the last 20 preseason AP number one ranked teams failed to win the national championship. That includes Georgia last season. Only Alabama in 2017 and Southern Cal in 2004 overcame the preseason number one jinx. And again, he's referencing there Godspeed, Georgia, because Georgia, once again, number one, as they should be. And first of all, do you put any stock into this, Stephen? Or do you believe that is, not that these teams are literally jinx, but just that it's hard to end the season number one when you start at number one?
I think it is. I think just in the kind of like scheduling wins and losses thought, it's really hard to go undefeated in college football. It's hard to be perfect. Like Georgia and Alabama and all these other teams in the SEC that have been good in the past, like you have sort of that target on you that, hey, you're the front runner. You're going to get everyone's best shot every week. I do think, as much as I love that statistic, I will take it from kind of this angle, which is during that span, that included the BCS era and the 4-team playoff. So your margin for error was smaller in both of those, certainly in the BCS where there was 2 teams, and in the playoff era where there was 4. Now you have a 12-team tournament where your margin for error is wider. And a team like Georgia that played arguably its worst game of the season in the SEC championship, or didn't look as crisp as we were used to seeing, I should say, they would have been in the playoff and they probably would have made some noise
Right.
had they got into that 12-team one. So I think if you're Georgia, you kind of have to be like, we've kind of started off with this dark magic tonight. Like, you probably don't like that stat, but at the same time, the 12-team playoff gives you an opportunity to sort of kind of overcome a loss or two and make that stat kind of meaningless this year.
Right. And the only, I mean, again, I have not done any research, so don't hold this to me, but the only team that I could think of, Stephen, just off the top of my head, of the last 20 years, he just referenced Brett McMurphy, 20 years, 18 of 20 failed to do it. I would say the last 20 years, and this may even be before that, but there's probably only been one preseason number one that would have failed to make the 12-team playoff if it existed for those 20
Yeah.
years. And the only one I can think of is the Lane Kiffin Southern Cal, which was a complete bust. Would there be, and again, this is right off the cuff, but would there be any other team that even comes to mind that wouldn't be a top 12-ish type team?
It's a great question. Off the top of my head, I don't think there has been. Like, you see, traditionally there are going to be teams that are ranked in the top 10 that do finish like closer to 20, or they just fall completely out of the poll. But for somebody to completely like whiff on 1, 2, 3, or 4 has to be a pretty steep like miss, like the USC thing, or there would have to be a ton of injuries. And there just really hasn't been a lot of that. And frankly, a lot of times it's sort of your traditional Alabama, Georgia, Ohio State, the traditional powers from recent years who are consistently really good.
Right. Hey, shout out cousin Carl here. Screen.
Thanks, cuz.
Cousin Carl says, Stephen, what's Mike got you on to make you show up for this? Go Vols. So, we got Stephen. He just showed me prior to we start. He's got like 3 liquids over there, so he's staying hydrated. I assure you. But hopefully you're not on any heavy medication that's going to make you fall asleep here.
I mean, somebody might suggest that if they don't like our rankings tonight, right? Or that gives us a good excuse, right?
Right, exactly. So, hey, let's get into it, Steven. I don't want to delay any longer. We got all 16 teams to hit on. Throw us a donation of any kind if you want your team thrown to the top of the list. But until then, we're going to go in alphabetical order. And let's go with Alabama, Steven. Top 5 players on the Crimson Tide. And perhaps before we do a deep dive on this, what was kind of your metric, your logic, so to speak, to ranking these top 5 guys? Because I know you and I are probably similar, but probably some differences there as well.
Yeah, I think it was just kind of starting from the sort of basic idea that who are the team's best players, and also taking into account positional importance in that as well. And I think there is a little bit of value to the team. Like, if you're a clear proven commodity like at safety and there's a lot of turnover at that position, I think that's worth a couple points in that discussion too. Also, certainly some projection, looking ahead to this year, who are some guys we think are going to break out. It's not necessarily a list of guys that it's career stats at this point, also trying to take everything into account, projection, what we think might happen this season, and also trying to work in some of that positional importance as well.
Okay. Cousin Shane, he says he's watching this from Cracker Barrel. He is working overtime to land us this Cracker Barrel. Anybody knows anybody at Cracker Barrel, please hook us up. We are not expensive, but it would, if nothing else, it would save Cousin Shane tremendously on his dinner bill, because he goes there religiously. But hey, shout out Cousin Rusty. He gave us $5 to start with them Ole Miss Rebels, Steven. So let's do Ole Miss first. Top 5 players off the Ole Miss Rebel roster.
So we'll start at, how about we start at 5, Mike? We'll
Yeah.
start from 5 and work our way down. Caden Prescorn at 5. I think just a fantastic first season at Ole Miss, a guy who was hurt in the preseason, but he really came on kind of as the season progressed. I expect him to be an even bigger part of the kind of the passing attack this year, especially with Jackson Dart getting more comfortable kind of in his senior year. At number 4, it's Princely, and we're going to see a theme here with 4 and 3, and that is, and throw Walter Nolan at number 3 because those are the transfers, defensive line. These are the two guys that Ole Miss is going to count on to turn this defensive line into a good group, into a great group. And you're bringing these guys in from the portal to make an impact. So Walter Nolan has been pretty good in his career. He made that jump freshman to sophomore. I think he can be an All-America caliber player. So I know maybe his stats don't match it yet, but that's why I've got him at number 3. And of course, like I mentioned, Princely at 4, the difference makers that Ole Miss now has on that defensive line. At number 2, Trey Harris, the outstanding receiver, breakout, I guess, year in the SEC after transferring in from Louisiana Tech last year. And of course, Jackson Dart at number 1. When I did my SEC quarterback rankings last week, I actually considered putting Jackson Dart at number 1. I think there's a good chance he may end the year as the SEC's best quarterback, but he's certainly my number 1 player for Ole Miss coming into this year.
Right, and I had Steven, so he and we did kind of combine on this list a little bit. Steven did most of the heavy lifting, but I made him bump up Trey Harris a little bit because Kiffin got me convinced on the last episode, Steven. He says Trey Harris may be our most improved player on the entire team, which, if that's not just coach speak, if he's speaking the truth there, that gives you an indication of what a tremendous year he can have. But do you think some people will take this as shade? This is not intending to be that way, Steven, but I can envision a scenario where Jackson Dart wins the Heisman Trophy. And I'm not saying that to say he's the best player in college football, but, who are the guys right now that are favored to do it? It's Carson Beck. It's Quinn Ewers. It's, I don't know, who else would be at the top of that list? Well, it doesn't matter. The point being, Stephen, is those players that are getting hyped to win the award, fair or not, the voters cast them aside as soon as they have a rough game. Whereas if someone like LSU comes out of nowhere and Jaden Daniels scores 50 touchdowns, they're like, give the Heisman to that guy. And not that Jackson Dart will be coming out of nowhere, but if Ole Miss does as well as I think they can and goes like 11-1, makes the college football playoff, they are going to reward someone on that football team, and I think it'll be Jackson Dart.
I don't think that's crazy at all. So to kind of go back to the question we had at the start with the number 1 team in the track record, how often does the preseason favorite win the Heisman Trophy? I mean, Devonta Smith wasn't number 1 in the Heisman preseason. Jaden Daniels wasn't. Caleb Williams, when he won it, I think he was pretty high, but I don't think he was preseason number 1. And also, you look at the Heisman odds this year, it is pretty wide open. It's hard to pick a front runner. So it does feel like somebody from that Jackson Dart tier could easily win the Heisman Trophy. But also, I think the upside for him this year is Juice Wells, Trey Harris, Caden Prescorn. The strength of that offense, it's Quinshot Judkins transferring to Ole Miss. It's the passing game this year. And as much as I know we like Ulysses Bentley, I think Jackson Dart could really take on more of that offensive workload, which kind of helps him in that Heisman discussion.
And Stephen, I can't believe this. I'm just blown away. Maybe this won't stun you at all, but I just looked it up while you were talking. Current Heisman Trophy odds. I thought it was Carson Beck. He is second. I thought it was Quinn Ewers. He is third. Do you have any idea right now today, as we're recording here, who has the best odds to win the Heisman Trophy?
It's not Shedeur Sanders, is it?
No, that'd be hilarious. It is Dylan Gabriel up at Oregon.
Okay.
Again, I'm not saying he's a bad player. I get it, all the Oregon hype, but that's pretty stunning to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of an easy pick if you're a Heisman sort of odds guy because he's going to put up numbers, number 1.
Mm-hmm.
Also, Oregon's going to be pretty good. And if you're thinking about how Heisman people vote, they vote quarterbacks on highly ranked teams that are really productive, so it makes sense.
Right.
But also, I think, Mike, that also sort of just solidifies this discussion we're having. It's open for Jackson Dart. I mean, Quinn Ewers, Carson Beck. I mean, Heck, if Nico, Nussmeier, somebody could come out of this pack of great quarterbacks in the SEC and win the award, because there is really no true front runner this season.
Right. But again, that's stunning to me. But okay, I wish you the well, Dylan Gabriel. You played at Oklahoma, you played your heart out. So I'm certainly not rooting against him. That's stunning to me. Hey, we had another donation here, Stephen. They wanted, I want to give him a shout out here. Da, 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 da. Big Buddy gave us $5. Appreciate you, Big Buddy. Stated old business, M-I-Z. So let's do Missouri next, Stephen. Who is your top 5 Missouri Tigers for the upcoming season?
We'll start at number 1 here, because I think it's kind of an easy pick, and he's one of my favorite players to watch in the country, and that is Luther Burden. Just all around dynamic playmaker, getting the ball through handoffs, passes, special teams, you name it. Easily the best pick for Missouri as the best player. At number 2, I've got Brady Cook. I think just the development that we saw last season, the growth overall, the potential to be even better this season with the weapons and the second year under Kirby Moore, I think Brady Cook stock is going to take off too. At number 3, we've got Dalen Carnell, one of the leaders of the revamped Missouri secondary, going to be a key piece to keeping that defense near the top of the SEC. At number 4, we've got Johnny Walker. Kind of the same theme here. Revamped defensive front. No more Darius Robinson. Other guys have moved on. Johnny Walker is going to be one of those guys kind of being tasked with taking his game from this level to the next level this season. So I like him at 4. And at number 5, we have Theo Wease, the Oklahoma transfer, outstanding last year. That gives Missouri 2 receivers in its top 5 this year.
Right, and this was not a team that was easy to do. So, some seasons, Missouri would be hard to pick 5 guys, quite frankly, a couple of years ago. But we ain't there now, because there's outstanding players like their right tackle, Membu. He's not on this list. Just missed the cut for me. I know Brett Norfleet is getting a ton of praise there as well. But, absolutely, Luther Burden will get to the top 25 players in all the SEC. He's going to get a mention there. You better believe it. But a lot of talent on this Missouri football team. And speaking of Heisman, Brady Cook is not far off that top list, 30-1 to win the Heisman, and Luther Burden 65-1. I don't necessarily agree that it should be in that order, or even the odds stacked essentially 2-1 Brady to Luther, but it's a quarterback award. It is what it is. So that's not a shot at Brady. It's more of exactly what you were saying, Stephen. Brady, again, not takes a back seat to Luther, but Luther just such a unicorn, if you will, in college football, that he may be the most dynamic player in all the country.
It almost feels like Luther Burden, I don't want to say could have the statistical type season that Devonta Smith had, but he also feels like he's got that potential. He has a huge game against Alabama in a year where if he has dominant stats, a lot of highlight type plays, big plays, that maybe he jumps onto the Heisman radar. Like, he could be like a good value pick if you're trying to bet the Heisman Trophy. I just think at some point the best player in college football is or most outstanding is what it's supposed to go to. And he kind of fit. I mean, I think he would certainly fit that for me. I will echo your point. Like, I had a couple of other offensive linemen, Caden Green, I think could work his way in here. Like you said, the right tackle, but also Marcus Carroll at running back, and throw in Toriano Pride at corner. Like, there's some depth here. These guys maybe aren't as proven, certainly in the SEC, but it does feel like there's really quality depth if you wanted to extend this list 6 through 10 for Missouri. Another reason to believe very much that this is a top 10 team this year.
Right. Missouri may have so many running backs, Texas may be trying to buy one of them if they could. You know what I mean?
But imagine if the portal was open right now, right?
Hey, we had another chat here. Let's see. Cousin William, let's give him a shout out here. Let me hear about those 0-13 of 2021 Kentucky Wildcats. So let's do Kentucky next, Stephen. Who's your top? And again, this is another one where some years could be difficult to peg Kentucky, but they got some really good players this year.
Yeah, they really do. I'll start at the bottom because we can tandem 4 and 5, and that is Barry and Brown at 4 and Dane Key at 5. The two receivers, dynamic and also very dependent on the development of Brock Vandegrift this season. Maybe they could be a little bit higher on this list if we knew how consistent Kentucky's passing game was going to be this year. But there is one area you would like to see a little bit more consistency because they both had 6 dropped passes last year. So 12 combined between Barry and Brown and Dane Key. You would like to see that number be a little bit lower. But certainly, if they're 4 and 5, that's a really good sign of depth for this Kentucky team. Maxwell Hairston, the outstanding defensive back last year, probably should be on the All America team for most this preseason. The interceptions, the return for touchdown, we've got him at number 3. At number 2, Jamon Dumas Johnson, the Georgia transfer, just another fortification of the Kentucky rush defense. You know, a rush defense that was one of the top in the SEC. They're adding an outstanding linebacker in Jamon Dumas Johnson to a group that already has J.J. Weaver and De'Aaron Jackson. This is one of the best linebacker groups in college football for 2024. And at number 1, it's Deion Walker. Every time I see the clip of Deion Walker sort of dropping back in pass coverage on the internet, I have to watch it just because somebody who's that big, that tall and that strong should not be moving that well in coverage. But he really is sort of the kind of, like I said, he sort of fortifies that defensive front for Kentucky. I think maybe underrated nationally, but easily the best player, I think, on Kentucky's team for 2024.
Yeah, and he's just he's built like some kind of I don't like a bronze statue out there. He's a monster
Yeah.
of a man. Just unguardable at times. So, I think he is not long for college football. I think he'll be in the NFL and a high round pick at that before long. He's been making impact plays since he was a freshman up there at Kentucky. But one of the most dynamic players in the country that certainly Kentucky fans know who he is, and a lot of SEC fans. But I think a lot of people in the country may be learning who Deion Walker is this fall as he makes a lot of big plays for the Kentucky Wildcats.
I agree, Mike. I think, like I said, he is very underrated and probably underappreciated outside of Lexington. I think other fans in the SEC know how good he is. I don't think nationally quite the deserved reputation yet that he is deserving of, considering how good he's been and how valuable he is to Kentucky's defense. Some other guys I think were in consideration here. De'Aaron Jackson, like I mentioned, J.J. Weaver, more outstanding linebackers, Eli Cox, one of the offensive linemen. It feels like Kentucky has a very solid foundation on the offensive line. Is someone going to be good enough to get into that top 5 is a question. And of course, the ultimate wild card is Brock Vandegrift. I did not have him in the top 5, but I think if you did a top 10 list, he's probably right there.
Right, and that's exactly where I wanted to go, Stephen. If Brock Vandegrift is in this top 5 by the end of the season, how many wins do you think Kentucky ended up with?
I think I'd probably put them a little bit closer to probably 8-4. Because look at their schedule: Georgia, Ole Miss, Texas, and Tennessee seem like games they will be an underdog in, but the rest are all very winnable. So I would probably go 8-4, hitting the over.
Right, and those most of those games Stephen just referenced: Ole Miss, Florida, Tennessee, and Texas, all on the road. Now they've owned Florida, but I just threw Florida in there because those are the only 4 road contests. But again, could they beat Ole Miss? Could they beat Tennessee and Texas? I certainly think they'll have a shot, but just playing those on the road make those even tougher of a task to actually accomplish. But ultimate wild card, Brock Vandegrift is, and we could sit here, we could basically say this. Been saying the same thing for 6 months until we actually see it. It is just around the corner. There's really no way to project what he's going to do.
Mike, I also think the injury to Chip Trainium, if you think about what that could mean for Kentucky in the first game of the season when they play Southern Miss with South Carolina coming up in week 2, I think you already kind of expected that you would see not the full arsenal, but I think you would want to see him sort of stretch his legs a little bit in that game, get him really comfortable. I think you'll see that even more now without your top running back, even if it is a game in Southern Miss where you should be able to win pretty easily.
Right. All right. Hey, looks like our next donation is a Tennessee fan. Well, actually, we got two here. We got one says, "Damn, cousin Shane got skinny." So that's a compliment to you, Stephen. Take that any compliment you can get.
Especially, I do like a good Cracker Barrel pancake breakfast. So we're just going to continue to show for Cracker Barrel.
Brought to you by Cracker Barrel. And then cousin Beauregard. I'm used to people missing E. Amaliava, but mispronouncing Kentucky is pretty wild. So he is a big Tennessee guy. So let's do Tennessee next, Stephen. Who do you got as the top 5 Volunteers?
So I think on a big picture level here, I think this Tennessee list is pretty deep. And it's also one of those lists too, when you start to get through guys like 6 through 10, it's also kind of like offensive and defensive linemen that just miss the cut. And I think that's a really good sign for Tennessee to have that much depth and quality starters in the trenches. So let's go right to the top. Number 1 was pretty easy, and that is James Pierce. You just look at his production last year. He didn't actually play kind of a full complement of defensive snaps. I thought it was pretty interesting to this offseason to look that he only played 462 defensive snaps. Like, he could play more this year and continue to grow into that role and even be even more productive for Tennessee. Kind of a scary thought for the rest of the SEC. So James Pierce, easy number 1 pick. Number 2, I've got Nico, and I know that may be kind of a projection. Maybe I'm getting ahead of myself. I think that's how good he can be this year. And so we'll get to guys 3 through 5, Cooper Mays at 3, Omari Thomas at 4, and Dylan Sampson at 5. I think all those guys from a statistical standpoint are way more proven. I just think the upside of Nico is too hard to ignore, and that's why I went with him at 2. Mike, feel free to disagree with me here.
Yeah, well, I'm throwing his stats. I mean, he's only got 314 passing yards in his college career. Now, again, that doesn't really mean much because he didn't play a ton. But if Nico is that good, Stephen, Tennessee's going to the college football playoff and maybe even be a factor to win it. If he is that good, I'm a little concerned with the hype getting a little out of control. And again, if he doesn't score 40 touchdowns, I think some people will say he's failed to live up to the hype, and that's kind of crazy. But that's where we're at these days. So it's going to be fascinating to see. I think he is certainly one of the players in the SEC with not the number 1, but probably in the top 5 of the most pressure and just everything that goes with all that on his shoulders this fall. And that's a tough place to be when you've started one game and some of the teams on your schedule, like Alabama, obviously, like a Georgia, and you could even argue Oklahoma, and that's probably it. But that have better talent than you. So I mean, again, if you're beating Bama, if you're beating Georgia, it's because you have an otherworldly quarterback that made plays to get you there. Otherwise, he could be pretty solid, and you still lose those games. So I don't know. There's just the weight of the world on him, and to come right out the gate and to put him on that kind of pedestal, I'm not doing it, Stephen. And I'll tell you why. Just because so many people are, I think it's almost safer to not and let him get there in a year or two.
I think kind of what you were getting at there is that he has I think he's got one of the probably highest upsides and ceilings of anybody here. I would throw like Garrett Nussmeier, Connor Wigman, like the middle of the SEC is going to be shaped, I think, by how these quarterbacks progress. But also he has the ability to be like the equalizer for Tennessee.
Right.
We kind of talked about how Tennessee's list kind of formed in. And if you have your starting center in the top 5, Lance Hurd, John Campbell, other guys on the defensive front are in here too. This is a deep list for Tennessee, but Nico could really raise the potential for all of them if he's that good. And I certainly know maybe I'm getting ahead of myself, but everything that I've seen, especially in the bowl game last year, the way Josh Heupel's offenses have performed, he just screams superstar, top quarterback, among the top quarterbacks in college football this year. So I'm just super, super high on Nico and put him at 2.
Let me frame it this way, though, Stephen, because I've not heard anyone say it, and I just, this just came to me. What if, could you see a scenario where Nico in his first year puts up like video game numbers because of the system he's in, because of the coach he's with, because of the players around him, and then against Alabama, against Georgia, maybe even Oklahoma, but really I'm talking Alabama, Georgia, and he struggles against those because I think that is that's obviously not what you're hoping for if you're a Tennessee fan, but I think that is a realistic scenario to where a year one quarterback is not going to dominate teams like that, but he may down the line. Could you, like, again, maybe he throws for like 3,800 yards, 35 touchdowns, and 5 picks, which those are terrific numbers, but he struggles in the biggest game or two of the season. Could you see that?
Yeah, I think so. I think especially against Georgia, because Georgia makes every quarterback look pretty silly, and especially Tennessee's under Josh Heupel has kind of struggled to find the right mix to attack Georgia's defense. Alabama will be interesting just because of the turnover in the secondary this year, but I did feel like watching Hendon Hooker year 1 to year 2, like there was just sort of like an intricacy, sort of like overall growth of the little small things you have to do to operate that offense that I could see like Nico being just better at those things in year 2, and becoming a more well-rounded quarterback next year, but really putting up huge numbers this year too.
Right. All right. Hey, I don't see any other donations, so hit us up with a donation. Let me double check real quick if you want your team thrown to the top of the list. Until then, let's go back to alphabetical here, Stephen. Let's go Alabama. We were going to go off the top, but we had a bunch of donations roll in. So who's your top 5 for them Alabama Crimson Tide?
An interesting thought on Alabama's list, because I actually had trouble getting to 5. And I feel like it's a really solid,
Gang Dynasty. No,
right?
I'm kidding.
The like 6 through like 12 or so is really solid, but it also felt like it's maybe not as top heavy as we're used to seeing. But there's some guys with some potential here. But we'll start at the top. I think the obvious one is Jalen Milroe. He was incredible, last year, sort of as the season went on, growing into that role. The all-around dynamic ability, but also what you've heard out of fall practice and how he is sort of becoming kind of a more well-rounded passer. All of those are good signs for Alabama this year. So Jalen Milroe at 1, easy pick. At 2, Tyler Booker, the outstanding offensive guard, just 2 sacks allowed last season. He will be critical along with Caden Proctor, Parker Brailsford to elevate this offensive line from last season to this year. I think they've got the pieces and coaching to do that, and I think that's why we're pretty high on Tyler Booker at 2. 3 and 4 come from the defensive side. That is Malachi Moore, the safety, at 3. One of the few proven players at Alabama returning in the secondary. And Deontay Lassan at linebacker at 4. We started to see him, I think, kind of come into his own a little bit last year. Suspect that he will be one of the leaders for this defense in 2024. And at number 5, Mike, this is where I had some trouble, because I think you could have went with Caden Proctor on the development front. You could have picked Parker Brailsford. You could have picked a transfer defensive back. I went with Justice Haynes. I know we disagreed last week on the running backs, Jam Miller or Justice Haynes, but somebody is going to break out here. I went with Justice Haynes. Mike, feel free to disagree with me.
Well, yeah, I mean, I did just see Jam Miller score multiple touchdowns in a scrimmage for what that's worth. But I think there's certainly a case to be made, Stephen. Again, this is not like Nick Saban was doing a bad job. I mean, that's silly. He's the greatest of all time. But I could see a scenario where guys that were not playing a big role make a big jump in this new system. And certainly there'll be guys, of course, many of them transferred out. So, but there'll probably be guys that don't play as well under DeBoer as they did it under Saban. So it's a two-way street. But I'm just kind of fascinated. I don't have any answers here, but I'll be fascinated to see who kind of embraces this coaching transition and players that maybe right now are completely under the radar that come into their own under this new coaching staff in Tuscaloosa.
It's a great question. I think somebody on the defensive line too could be in this conversation, whether it's Jaheim Otis, Keenan, somebody, Campbell at linebacker. If you want to be like really bold, how about Ryan Williams at receiver? Like somebody's going to catch passes in this offense. We saw it at Washington the last couple of years and the success that the receivers had. Maybe it's Jeremy Bernard, but I guess in the big picture theme, it does feel kind of way more fluid than usual for Alabama. We're just used to kind of seeing them in the top 5 and, top 3, but there does seem to be a little bit more of an unknown quantity to this team this year.
Yeah, no, I know it. That's makes them one of the more fascinating teams, not only in the SEC but the country, to watch this season. Hey, shout out Liquid Flames here, our good buddy Dustin there. Chomp chomp. He wants them Gators, Steven. So, who are your top 5 Florida Gators?
We will start at number 1, and I don't know in my wildest dreams if I would have predicted this player would be number 1 for Florida going into 2024 last year, and that's Graham Mertz at quarterback. Just a surprising breakthrough season under Billy Napier last year, and just the efficiency. You would like to see a little bit more big playability, but the overall efficiency, sort of direction of the offense, really solid first year from Graham Mertz, and he's our number 1 player. At number 2, Eugene Wilson. I think he is primed for a breakout year at receiver. Ricky Pearsall moving on to the NFL. I think Wilson and Elijah Badger, the Arizona State transfer, will be a very solid 1-2 punch for Graham Mertz at receiver. Number 3, Montrell Johnson. Obviously a little bit banged up so far with a knee injury. I think at some point he'll come into form and be 100% during the year. Probably one of the SEC's top running backs for sure this season, even if he's a little bit slowed in the first couple games of the season. 4 and 5 are tough because they come from the side of the ball that Florida needs to improve the most on, and that is on defense. So number 4 is a guy who struggled last year in Jason Marshall at cornerback. I'm putting him on this list because I think he's going to bounce back. So we've got Jason Marshall at 4 and Shamar James, the linebacker, at 5. Obviously injured last season, but on track to get back to 100% for 2024.
Yeah, and this is another one, Stephen, that I love this 5. I like the top 5, and not a much debate for me. But it's funny that Billy Napier he continues to hype up this team as the most veteran, the most talented, the most complete, yada yada yada. But when you see this being your entrenched 5 here, I see some massive star potential here with this group, and again, this is a reason why I continue to harp on the Florida Gators being one of the biggest surprises in the country. People that think that they're just going to be garbage, I don't think they have a firm grasp on what they really have down there in Gainesville.
I think it's Billy Napier's best roster for sure. I think the roster is in way better shape than it was. I think if you look kind of beyond that top 5, I like a couple of the offensive linemen. Pup Howard. sorry, Pup Howard on defense, but also the Austin Barber, Jake Slaughter combination potentially on that offensive line. So I think there's some really kind of quality depth that once you get beyond that top five, and this list looks even better for Florida if your guys on defense take a big step forward, because that offensive trio, Mertz, Wilson, and Johnson, is pretty good.
Steven, I got sidetracked here. You remember this was like 2-3 months ago. Someone was asking us about Deion Smith down there at Ole Miss, and Steven was like, "Who's that?" And I was doing it too, but then I remember, yeah, junior college transfer. He literally, I don't even think he's officially cleared. I think there's been reports he got cleared. We're doing this. This is August 13th. Ole Miss has a game in 2 weeks, and I don't mean to pick on Jerry. He's a great guy here. Bold prediction: Deion Smith, Ole Miss has 1,200 receiving yards, fresh off JUCO. He's going to be in a uniform for 10 days, and he's going to tear up the SEC. And again, Jerry's not alone here. I mean, we've been told he's going to be one and done. He's the next Randy Moss. This is the crazy stuff where people get really crazy right before football. We're all going undefeated. We're going to whoop everybody's ass. This guy that literally, we don't even know what shape he's in. We don't know what size cleat he's been, because he's literally just joined us. He's going to have 1,200 receiving yards, despite the fact we may have the best, maybe not the best, but 2 of the top 3 receivers in the entire country is on our roster. But this other guy's going to have 1,200. Steve, we gotta cool it with this Deion Smith. I'm tired of hearing a bit about Deion Smith, because if he doesn't have 1,000 yards, people are gonna say he didn't live up to the hype, and that's damn crazy.
Yeah, I mean, I think by all indications, everything I've seen from JUCO scouting, everything you read, that he is going to be a big time player for Ole Miss. I think that's a little optimistic. I always say this about JUCOs too. I think it's always to sort of lower the expectations in year one, because it does seem like it takes them over half of a season, and then it's that second year that they really take off once they get settled and sort of settle into that high level of competition. So, and the good thing for Ole Miss, they don't need him to be a superstar, because they've got Juice Wells, they've got Trey Harris, they've got Prescorn, they've got some other depth at receivers. So, yeah, I mean, very optimistic. I admire the offseason optimism. I will tell you, going back to the Deion Smith thing, one of the things, when you got asked that question, it threw me off, was because there was a Deion Smith that played running back at Colorado a few years ago. And my mind saw Deion Smith and Ole Miss had connected running back. And I thought, Kiffin's like the 12th running back that Kiffin has brought in this offseason. And then in my mind, oh yeah, there's a receiver, Deion Smith. So yeah, it's been a long offseason, Mike. I can't wait to actually get some games here.
All right, how about I'm not seeing any of their donations unless I missed any, but let's do Arkansas, Stephen, where they have one heck of a number one, certainly.
Yeah, number one was very easy, and that is Landon Jackson, the defensive lineman. No doubt about it. We saw the development from 2022 to 2023, his overall growth as a player. I think he's going to be an All-America player for Arkansas this season. So he was an easy number one pick. At number two, we went with a bit of a projection. We went with Taylon Green, the starting quarterback for Arkansas. I know Mike is very high on him. I think by all accounts, everything that you hear, read out of Arkansas, they've been very happy with what they've been getting from him since he came to the Razorbacks from Boise State. So Taylon Green at 2, Josh Braun, probably the bright spot on a very suspect offensive line last year, is number 3. Andrew Armstrong, the receiver, at 4. And at 5, a bit of a projection, but Luke Haas, the tight end. I think he's going to continue that fantastic start that he had last season. I think he'll continue that into 2024.
Yeah, and I actually had Steven bump Luke Haas down a little bit. I think he was well on his way to being freshman All-American, but he only played a couple games. Now, he looked outstanding in the games he played. So I'm not throwing shade at him at all. I know recently he was in concussion protocol, so his camp got again, not ended or anything like that, but a little sideline there. But I think in Bobby Petrino's offense, that's where you get a guy like Luke Hawes get maximizing his potential. That's where you get Taylon Green, who, by all accounts, in spring, in summer, and now in training camp, Stephen, is just the talk of Fayetteville, and that's inside the building too. I mean, they seem over the moon with this guy. So I'm hoping that he can come in and provide them that spark. But if he's number two, then the optimism that I sense for the Razorbacks will be valid, because that means he's one heck of a player, and it means Arkansas is going to beat some of these people that we look at the schedule today and we project as losses. If he's this good, he's going to flip a game or two at least, I think.
Yeah, I agree with you, because I think this list kind of shows that Arkansas has some upside here, because they've got one of the best defensive players in the SEC in Landon Jackson. Also, some pretty good defensive linemen too around him. I mean, I would say it's not like there's not going to be a ton of guys that get a lot of preseason All SEC buzz, but there's some really solid players there. You could also throw in, like, if Xavier Sori reaches his potential at linebacker, a position that's had a lot of turnover, you've got a potential star. Jalen Braxton could become a kind of a shutdown corner and be an All SEC guy by season's end. They've got good pass catchers, and I think it really all comes back down to offensive line and Taylon Green. And if he ends up being Arkansas' second best player, that's a really good sign for Sam Pittman and Bobby Petrino.
Mm-hmm. How about this one, Stephen? We got a comment here. Cousin Brian, appreciate you, Cousin Brian. He says, Cousin Shane gonna need a cigarette after hearing Stephen love on them balls.
He's out there he's out there at Cracker Barrel sitting in the rocker chair just right there.
Appreciate you, Cousin Brian. What a photo too. That's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
But and again, I know JaQuinton Jackson's someone that you're really high on too for Arkansas, Stephen, and I keep hearing good things about Gums, the other tight end. I mean, I think they're going to utilize the 2 tight end system quite a bit there in Fayetteville. Isaiah Satania, if he can emerge as a true weapon at return. I mean, there's some good options for the Razorbacks too.
For sure. A receiving core, Mike, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. I think your numbers had him as number 1 in returning production and receiving yards for this season. I mean, there's a lot of really good skill talent. Plus, I think as much as been the concerns about the offensive line are valid, I do think Taylon Green's mobility is sort of the X factor there and can make up for at least some of those concerns. Like, if you have a quarterback like him that is that dynamic on the ground, and I know Sam Pittman's made the point that he's a passer. He doesn't, he's not out there to run every time, but that's a lot better than having a quarterback back there that's just going to be a statue in this offense. And his mobility could really help this offense kind of grow as the season goes on.
William wants to know, Stephen, are you going to Nico's Heisman ceremony? All right, let's do Auburn next, Stephen. Who's your top 5 Auburn Tigers?
Mike, I think this was one of the teams that I had the toughest time putting together, and I think there's a really solid group of talent. It's just that I don't know there's going to be an obvious easy number 1 selection, but we went with Eugene Asante at linebacker as our best player for Auburn for this season. Jarquez Hunter at 2. I think you could make a case either one of those 2 could probably be number 1, and you feel good about it. Hunter got better as the season went on last year. You'd like to see him probably be a little bit more productive at the start this year. And of course, Asante was just all over the field. You think back to that game against California early in the year. I think he's one of the best linebackers in the SEC for this season. At number 3, might be the guy that ends up at number 1 by the end of the year, and that's Cam Coleman, the freshman. So throw Cam Coleman at 4. His running mate at receiver, Keandre Lambert-Smith at 4, and Jalen McLeod, the linebacker, edge rusher. Really nice season after transferring in from Appalachian State last season. He's our number 5 player for Auburn this year.
Any concern that 2 of the top 5, though, Stephen, or one's a transfer and one's a true freshman, just given the fact that Auburn needs kind of a immediate impact, and again, they're not alone. Heck, we just did Arkansas. They need immediate transfer for or impact from Taylon Green, a transfer. So, but to make Auburn go, it almost feels like Auburn's not going to go if these new weapons don't materialize immediately.
Yeah, I agree with that. And also a lot of that, this too is on how much Peyton Thorne progresses in his second year as the starter. I know Mike was paying close attention to my Auburn list in the beginning because I was trying to sneak Peyton Thorne in there as a little bit of a projection, but he quickly rejected me on that one. So I do think there is a little bit of just concern when you look at this list because I there it does seem kind of more open. I guess there's just not a slam dunk number one. It feels like there's a lot of really solid pieces to that. There also could be an argument that hey, by the end of the year, Keldrick Falk, somebody in the secondary, Cam Coleman, Jalen McLeod, like some of these pieces that have upside, if they take their game to the next level, combined with the transfer pieces, then maybe this list looks a lot different by the end of the year. But yeah, a lot of relying on new pieces for the passing game to click at Auburn this year.
And the way Hugh tells it, he should have beat Nick Saban every damn time he faced him. But all right, hey, let's move on to Georgia, Steve. We talked a little Georgia, but we haven't talked their top five. No Brock Bowers this year. So who are the top five dogs?
Mike, this was pretty difficult to do because Georgia does not lack for options. I think there's a debate at number one. I think you could have Malachi Starks or Carson Beck at number one. We went with Starks at one. I would not disagree with you if you wanted to put Carson Beck at one. So we have Malachi Starks at one, Carson Beck at two, Tate Ratledge, the outstanding offensive lineman. He is our number three Georgia Bulldog for this season. Worth noting that he did not allow a sack last year. I think that's a pretty important stat. Just anytime, just evaluating offensive linemen, that kind of stood out to me in this offseason in preseason research. 4 and 5, two linebackers, Michael Williams and his running mate Mondon. So kind of the strength of that Georgia defense at the second level. I am very curious to see how Michael Williams is used this year and how that translates because Georgia doesn't necessarily need more sacks. They just need probably a little bit more havoc, a little bit more pressure. And I think using Williams a little bit more this season and kind of that role off the edge could really help that defense. So this is 5 potential All-Americans in Georgia's top 5 for sure.
Right. And some guys that I would think just, barely missed the cut. I would think of Dominic Lovett right there on the fringe. I don't think it's, unless you want to go full projection, I think Dylan Bell possibly, but I think by the end of the year could be on this list. I wouldn't put him there today, but I think he's got that potential. And just, nearly everybody on the defensive side of the football, and they keep hyping up the freshman Bolden at safety. But again, I don't know if any true freshman outside of Cam Coleman, where he's instant starter, and not only starter but maybe number one receiver for a football team. It's going to be hard for a true freshman to be on a list like this. But of course, if there are, Georgia's probably got them because of the way they recruit. You know what?
Yeah, for sure. I think if there's a true freshman that cracks this list for Georgia by the end of the season, they're pretty good because this is a pretty strong top 5. And even after that, I mean, Trevor Etienne, someone else on the offensive line, Ernest Green, Xavier Truss, throw Xavier Stackhouse, CJ Allen. I mean, I keep going. This is a ridiculously deep roster, as if you didn't know that already.
All right, how about LSU Tigers? Steven, lost a lot to the NFL, but got a lot of future NFL talent on this roster as well.
Yeah, still a pretty good top 5, I think. We'll start right at the top with Will Campbell, the outstanding tackle. LSU is one of the better tackle combinations in college football. I think it's easy to kind of think that Will Campbell should be one of the top players overall in the nation this season. 0 sacks allowed. Also graded out as one of the best run blockers last season in college football by some of the advanced metrics that I look at for offensive linemen. So Will Campbell at 1, Harold Perkins 2. Very interested to see how Blake Baker is able to get the most out of his ability this season. Emory Jones, the other tackle for LSU, is our number 3 player, followed by Garrett Nussmeier at 4 and Kyron Lacey at 5.
Mm-hmm. And it's pretty wild, isn't it, Stephen, that you could have 2 first-round receivers, and then the next year you got Kyron Lacey already in the top 5. I'm not doubting that at all, but I'm just saying, I mean, this is wide receiver you here down here.
It's a nice luxury to have, right? To lose to guys like Malik Neighbors and Brian Thomas and be able to reload of someone that has the talent and already production of Kyron Lacey. That's a pretty good starting point if you're Garrett Nussmeier. And we already saw these two really kind of hit off that connection in the bowl game last year against Wisconsin.
Right, and you know, Mason Taylor, throw him into the mix here.
Yeah.
It's wild that that you could have, again, so much production lost to the NFL, yet so much potential star power returning this year for them LSU Tigers. But that's because Brian Kelly's got it rolling down there.
Yeah, and also I think notable on this list that 4 of the 5 come from the offensive side of the ball, and also just continues the theme that we've talked about this offseason, which are big questions on defense. And also, if somebody from the defensive side of the ball is going to finish in the top 5, who is it going to be? Like, is it a Major Burns? Is it Greg Penn at linebacker? There's not a lot of obvious options. And I think that's kind of where the intrigue from a player standpoint comes for me, is what other LSU defensive players work their way into that top 5 discussion by the end of the year.
Any chance LSU is again, they'll have to go about it a different way, but maybe not as effective on offense because they were quite literally the number 1 offense last year. But one of the best offenses in the SEC with the running game, led by that offensive line, of course, play action, big arm Garrett Nussmeier pushing the ball down the field. You know, that they're outscoring everybody and they can't stop anybody, but they could still get to 10 wins. Could you see that path?
Yeah, I think so. I think the offense is still going to be very good. I know you. I know you kind of like didn't like my idea that you can't get any worse on defense, but I do subscribe to the theory like there is sort of a like a baseline of like competence that could be coming back to the defense with, and also I think just the way that I think the players may embrace Blake Baker a little bit more so than I think we saw last year's defensive staff. I think they'll be a little bit better, maybe not as good offensively, but still winning with that group again in 2024.
Right. Well, it's fine to say literally anybody could excite them more than Matt House. You know what?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's that image of him talking to the players after I think the bowl game really, but sticks in my mind as sort of like, yeah, there's something amiss here.
Yep. Hey, shout out cousin Jared. He says LSU's got 5 first rounders on this roster. My goodness, that'd be, they're going to be a hell of a lot better team than I kind of project if that's true. And he may be right there.
Mike, there is kind of that open spot as far as like who is the best quarterback for the NFL draft next year. And there has been some buzz, like maybe Garrett Nussmeier is the one who could kind of come out of nowhere. Not going to say nowhere, but isn't projected like the Carson Becks and Shedeur Sanders to be that first quarterback off the board. That maybe it's Garrett Nussmeier. He could grow into that role this year. So combine that with Harold Perkins and some offensive linemen and some other pieces. I mean, it's not super crazy to think that at all.
No, especially, again, playing for Brian Kelly, who he's got a long track record of getting guys. He knows what it takes to get a guy ready and have them on the NFL's radar. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, certainly doesn't hurt LSU's NFL kind of scouting, I guess, that Jaden Daniels is off to such a great start with Washington. He looked pretty good in that preseason game on Saturday or Sunday, I think.
Right. All right. How about Mississippi State, Stephen? Again, this is this is the toughest team, I think, to project. What do you have for the top 5 Bulldogs?
Absolutely. It is the toughest team to figure out a top 5 because there are so many transfers on a team with 2 returning starters. So I kind of went with the obvious, and that's Blake Shapen. He is our number 1 player for Mississippi State. Jeff Lebby picked him out of the portal to operate his high-powered offense. So obviously, I think off to a good start based upon what we've seen out of the spring so far this fall. I think there's an expectation that he will be able to get this offense going quickly. So if that's the case, he's probably going to be the best player on a team that's got a lot of questions. So Blake Shapen is our number 1 pick. On the other side of the ball is Corey Ellington, the safety, one of the few proven pieces for this defense. So we went with him at 2. It is wide open pretty much. After that, Kelly Akari, the UTEP transfer at receiver at 3, Ethan Miner, the center transfer from North Texas at 4, and Stone Blanton at 5.
Mm-hmm. And Liquid says, does the cowbell, can that count as one of their top 5 players? It may have to, with with that home field advantage, yeah. That those damn cowbells ringing those opponents' ears. You know what?
I mean, I think you summed it up well in our pre-show prep for Mississippi State. That what do you do here? Like shrug,
Yep. Well, one team we don't have to do that for, Stephen. I know they're new to the SEC, but not new to certainly you. Oklahoma, who's your top 5 Sooners?
Sorry, Mike, I needed a cough break there. So, so we'll start at number 1. Danny Stutzman, the outstanding linebacker, one of my preseason All-Americans at that position. At number 2, Billy Bowman, another guy who I think should be in the All-America mix this year at safety. 3, Deion Burks, the Purdue transfer at receiver, especially with Jaden Gibson out for the year. I think Deion Burks is going to be an even bigger force in that passing game. At number 4, Jackson Arnold, I think is going to have a breakout year at quarterback. I know he's been a little bit up and down in the fall, but I think by game time, I think he will be ready to go and in for that breakout season. And at 5, Nick Anderson, the outstanding receiver.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of star power here with the Oklahoma Sooners coming into this conference. I'm just so fascinated to see what they're able to do. And again, the schedule makers did them no favors, certainly. But, man, with all the buzz that I'm hearing in Norman out of Deion Burks, he could be one of the biggest stars in this conference. And certainly with, we'll have to see how far along Jackson Arnold is in his first season as a starting quarterback. But massive potential that guy has. And he's not just a big arm. He can run too. So I don't know. This is one of the toughest teams to peg in the entire conference.
It is. And I also think, when you start kind of looking at kind of the breakdown here, 3 of the 5 coming on offense, a first-time starter at quarterback, a transfer receiver, but no lineman in this top 5 mix right now. Doesn't mean that like an Ethan Downs or a Demonic Williams may step into that top 5 at some point this season. And of course, we know about the offensive line questions, but there is, I think this list also shows the upside, like a quarterback of Jackson Arnold's potential with 2 outstanding receivers, the outstanding season that Nick Anderson had last year, where like 10 of his 38 catches went for touchdowns, and Deion Burks was awesome on a Purdue team that wasn't very good last year. So it's a really interesting mix of pieces here for Oklahoma, but I think a pretty solid top 5.
Mm-hmm. Well, how about for South Carolina, Stephen, a team that has to play Oklahoma this year? What do you got as the top 5 Gamecocks?
We'll start at number 1, and that is Debo Williams, the outstanding linebacker. Mike, I think much like Danny Stutzman, kind of a, almost like a throwback, kind of a traditional linebacker. I think I loved watching his breakout season last year. So he's our number 1 player. Close behind is Tonka Hemingway, the defensive lineman. And I think you just kind of look at his value to the team, graded out well in advanced analytics against the run. His running mate, TJ Sanders, is also on this list, just a little bit behind him. But right at the top, Debo Williams, 1, Tonka Hemingway, 2, Rocket Sanders at 3. A bit of a projection that he gets back on track at South Carolina after battling some injuries at Arkansas. I mentioned TJ Sanders. He is 4, the other South Carolina defensive lineman. And at 5, Lenora Sellers, the quarterback. So a bit of a projection, but that's kind of the upside I think we're looking at with Sellers for this season.
I feel like South Carolina fans called you out so hard, Stephen, back in what was it, like February, that now you are driving the bus for this Lenoris Sellers hype. True or false?
Can I plead the fifth in that one? You know, what's funny about that is I've seen other quarterback rankings where they're lower on Sellers than I was and probably still am. I don't see the same, complaints about those lists. So there's still plenty of time for South Carolina fans to send their army of fans to those sites before the season gets going.
Right. And it's going to be wild to see what Rocket Sanders can provide to the Gamecocks here transferring over. He's 100% there. He's not limited in camp, but they're being very careful with him, which is wise because this is going to be his money year. He's going to be. I know they have McDowell. They have what is it? Oscar Ottaway, is that his name, from North Texas? Another transfer. So they've got other guys, but though, with all due respect, because I'm a big Juju McDowell fan too, but I don't think you load up Juju McDowell and he's going to win you an SEC game. You load up a Rocket Sanders. He's proven he can win you an SEC game. So, I'm fascinated. I think Rocket Sanders, if they can block for him in this, and this is a make as much as we focus on Lenore Sellers, Stephen, I truly think this is a make or break year for Dow Loggins.
Agreed.
Fair or not. I know it's just year 2, but that was an interesting hire. And anytime someone makes a hire and they say, well, hell, 5 other teams wanted him. Well, why didn't they hire him? I mean, because no disrespect, but he didn't pick South Carolina over 5 other SEC programs. He went to the one that gave him the job.
Also, traditionally, I would say most head coaches, if you whiff on 2 offensive coordinator hires, it's going to be hard to sell that you can deserve a third one. I'm not saying that Shane Beamer's on the hot seat, but I also think given the personnel that they have and the offensive line, you would think can stay healthier this year. Sellers and Sanders, I think the way they could use those on the ground can allow Sellers some time to grow as a passer and kind of grow into this offense. So I'm interested to see how Loggins sort of deploys that sort of thinking on the field this year.
Mm-hmm. And they have brought in, Stephen, I don't know if you saw this or not, but who was that Alabama coach before Saban? Was Mike no, not Price, but
Mike Shula?
Shula. So they brought in Shula as an analyst. And I'm just saying, that's an interim OC if they need one. I'm just throwing it out there. I hope it doesn't come to that, but I'm throwing it out there.
I think that's a wise thought, Mike. Always good to have somebody who's capable of being a backup play caller on staff, right? Easy change during the season.
Because before that, it was what's that guy? NFL guy played quarterback at Bama.
Freddie Kitchens.
Yeah, they had him in there for the same exact thing. But I digress. I'm not trying to pile on South Carolina. Let's do Texas, Steve. It's top 5 Longhorns.
Micah, this is a pretty solid top 5. Much like Georgia, I think there is some quality depth here. So also like Georgia, I think you can make a case for a couple different players at the top. I've got Kelvin Banks, the left tackle, at 1. If you want to go Quinn Ewers, who is 2 on our list, I can't disagree with you. Quarterback, left tackle, positional importance, both there. But it is Kelvin Banks at 1, Quinn Ewers at 2, Jahdae Barron, the sort of jack of all trades defensive back for Texas, at 3, Anthony Hill, the linebacker, after an outstanding freshman season, he is 4, and Isaiah Bond is 5, the Alabama transfer receiver.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, again, this is just I don't want to say a difficult one because they got a lot of star power up there. And speaking of future NFL players, they're all over this roster. But um, Texas, I'm just looking at it. I mean, I think if Bond hits, he's probably a high level draft pick as well. Obviously, Quinn Ewers has the talent. That's probably why he came back because he I have no idea, but I would imagine he didn't get a first round grade, come back to earn that, and certainly Kelvin Banks. So I'm just counting the just first rounders in this top 5, and there's probably at least 3 here.
Not to mention, if you kind of look beyond that top 5, and I would agree with you, like I think Quinn Ewers he's another guy much like Garrett Nussmeier. I think that his stock during the season is going to be very interesting to watch because there's so many high profile matchups now in the SEC with Quinn Ewers. Like he will have a chance to raise his stock among the NFL draft. But even someone like Malik Muhammad, I mean, he's just a sophomore, but if he ends up being that lockdown corner on the outside, he's going to be a guy that in next year's draft, they'll be talking a lot about. So, Malik Muhammad, but also Trey Moore, the UTSA edge rusher, is a guy that you're hearing a lot of positive buzz out of fall camp for Texas, who could be one of those sort of kind of fast twitch edge rushers that Texas could really use this season.
Mm-hmm. How about A&M, Stephen? Who's your top 5 Aggies going into year 1 under Mike Elko?
Mike, I think for this top 5 for Texas A&M, we have to start on the defensive line, and it starts with Shamar Turner at 1, Nick Scorton at 2. You could flip those. I think Scorton is proven in the Big Ten. I think Shamar Turner much more proven in the SEC. So we went with Turner over Scorton at 3. Bit of a projection, but Connor Wigman, I think much like Nico, much like Garrett Nussmeier, in for a breakout season at quarterback. That is why he is 3. Torian York at 4, and Trey Zune, the offensive lineman, at 5.
Don't let Stephen fool you. He wanted Scorton 1, and he's showing his quarterback bias here with Connor Wigman. I'm just kidding. But Connor Wigman, again, I don't put quite honestly, Stephen, I don't put any stock in these draft people that don't really follow college football, and then months after the season they're like, hey, do you know Jaden Daniels he's a good player? Like, yeah, no shit, but
I appreciate their thoughts always on like the playoff and conference realignment like months after the fact, right?
Yeah. But some of those guys, again, it's not unanimous, but some of those guys are really warming up apparently to Wigman and what he did as a freshman and sophomore and all this. But so I know that's not what you're going for here, but certainly the potential is there. And if he's that good and he displays it this year, A&M's going to be one heck of a team combined with this defensive line, which I know I've talked up Tennessee's defensive line. I think it's deeper potentially than A&M's, but may not have the star power outside of Pierce that this Aggie defensive line may have this fall.
I think that's a good way to sum it up. It feels like Tennessee has probably the best player of the 2 defensive fronts, and they probably have more depth, but A&M would kind of get like the next couple with Scorton and Turner. Throw Shamar Stewart, DJ Hicks in there too. They're going to be really good up front for Texas A&M. But I think this is also kind of a theme of the season for me is there's great quarterback play, but also the defensive lines in this conference. I mean, it's funny to look at like the all SEC teams and see Arkansas, Kentucky, Ole Miss, Tennessee may have, that's maybe your best, your best players on the defensive front may come there. I don't think Alabama is going to have a preseason one, and at least on the first team. And, depending on how you feel about Georgia, they may not either. So kind of an interesting year, but also a really deep, from a team perspective, group of defensive lines coming back.
Mm-hmm. All right. So last team to hit on here, Stephen, Vanderbilt. Who's your top 5 Commodores?
3 of the top 5 come from the defensive side of the ball, and that is CJ Taylor at 1, Langston Patterson at 2, DeRicky Wright at 3. Getting him to come back to Vanderbilt, a huge get for Clark Lee after the kind of spring transfer to Texas A&M. So top 3 players for Vanderbilt all come on defense. That's a great sign for Clark Lee as he takes over the defensive play calling duties. The last 2 players on here, Diego Pavia at 4 and Cedric Alexander at 5. So a bit of a projection for those last 2 spots for Vanderbilt.
Cousin Shane wants to know who's your bottom 5 for Vanderbilt, but let's not go there because that's funny, but it's cruel. So again, Vanderbilt, tough to do. You got transfers, you got a young running back, but certainly those trio of defenders, I don't think there's any doubt those are their 3 best players. But could be Diego Pavia.
Bottom 5 at Vanderbilt could be the hire of Carl Durrell as offensive coordinator when Derek Mason was the head coach. But sorry. I know we're talking this year's team, but that was such a horrible hire. I had to bring it up. So.
Yep. I wonder if that guy still has a job. I don't anywhere, but that's neither here nor there. So we also got the top 25 players in all the SEC for this season. So do you want to start at the bottom or the top here?
How about we start at the bottom? We'll go. I'll throw out like Mike. I'll throw out 5 in a row here, and I'll let you kind of commentate on kind of my first 5 here. But let's start at 25 with safety Malachi Moore at Alabama. 24, Smael Mondon, the linebacker from Georgia. 23, Jahdae Barron, the safety at Texas. 22, Brady Cook, quarterback of Missouri, and defensive lineman Walter Nolan for Ole Miss is 21.
You just love you some Walter Nolan and that 5-star hype. I kid, but he's a solid player. Certainly, if we want to project him forward, so he's another one. This could be a money year for him. He has a big year. He's probably off to the NFL, and he's probably a high round pick. If he has a slow year, inconsistent year, probably not so much. So again, I think that's a little bit of a projection. I certainly would probably put him towards the tail end of a lot of these guys that I think have been far more productive in college. And if we want to project, I would probably throw Brady Cook slightly higher because I think there's a very real shot. And I've said it before, I think he could be the most productive quarterback in the SEC. I'm not saying he's the most talented, but I think with his team, with the weapons, with the schedule, I mean, he could have 40, 45 touchdowns, and it wouldn't – that'd be a great year, but it wouldn't completely stun me, if that makes sense.
I think Brady Cook's too low now that I look at it. We should have had him higher. That's an error on my part. So yeah, what's also a 5-star is that pancake breakfast at Cracker Barrel. I'm sure so that's the Walter Nolan of all meals at Cracker Barrel. So yeah. Anyway, so on to the next 5. It is Emory Jones, the offensive tackle at LSU. Landon Jackson, the defensive lineman at Arkansas, is 19. Michael Williams, linebacker, edge rusher extraordinaire from Georgia at 18. Nick Scorton, the defensive lineman from Texas A&M at 17. And Tate Ratledge, the offensive lineman from Georgia at 16.
Yeah. And again, not a bad pick here. I love how the majority of these guys are on the line of scrimmage.
Right.
And this is what we try to tell Oklahoma and Texas people. And Sark got the message pretty quickly when he got whooped by Arkansas. But you got to be elite on the line of scrimmage if you want to compete at a high level in this conference. And, no problem with any of these selections. They're all stars. They're all future NFL players. And quite frankly, a couple of these guys could be in the NFL already, but they made the decision to come back, and they'll probably all improve their stock this fall.
Yeah, that's a great observation. I think we haven't even hit the top 10 to 15. And 16 through 25, a lot of these guys are on the All-America team on the second and third teams, and they all come on the line of scrimmage. That's sort of kind of fortifying the idea of how deep of a year it is on the defensive front in the SEC. There's a really high level group of edge rushers, interior players coming back in the conference this year.
Yep. All right. So, Steve, who you got? What would it be? 11 through 15 here.
Yeah. So at 15, we'll continue the line of scrimmage. Shamar Turner from Texas A&M, the second defensive lineman from A&M to appear on this list. Danny Stutzman, the linebacker from Oklahoma, at 14. Tyler Booker, the guard from Alabama, 13. Trey Harris, the receiver from Ole Miss, at 12. Harold Perkins, the linebacker from LSU, at 11.
Whew. I mean, the higher we go up this list, the more elite the talent of these teams gets, Stephen. I mean, I could see potential Heisman winners here. I could see future award winners here. I mean, heck, I think even Harold Perkins, had we done this list last year, he's probably higher on the list. And we, no need to rehash what all happened last year, but he's got potential to jump way up this list if he fits into Blake Baker's system. And quite frankly, Blake Baker's hyping him up this fall, so he certainly will be. Trey Harris, Lane Kiffin's hyping him up. Tyler Booker's been a day one impact player at Alabama of all places. So Danny Stutzman, maybe the finest linebacker in the entire country. Man, a lot of stars here.
I think you could probably have Danny Stutzman and Harold Perkins like really close together. I think you could argue that Stutzman probably should be ranked higher based upon maybe what they've done so far. I think Perkins probably has more upside coming into this year. So that's kind of why I think Perkins is rated a few spots higher. But like I said, if you want to rank Stutzman ahead because he's more proven, no disagreement here. I mean, frankly, these are two of the best, probably four linebackers in college football, and they're in the top 15 of the SEC. I mean, it just goes to show you that, like we said, the depth along the line of scrimmage. So at 10, we'll start with the run of quarterbacks and go Jackson Dart at 10, Quinn Ewers at 9, Jalen Milroe at 8, Deion Walker, the defensive lineman from Kentucky, at 7, and Carson Beck, the quarterback from Georgia, at 6. So 4 of the 5 spots here are quarterbacks.
It's like an NFL draft, Stephen. Once the run begins, they just go in succession. But yeah, I can't. I can't dispute any of these. I mean, consensus. Carson Beck is the best quarterback in the SEC, if not the country. Debatable. I guess you could say Quinn Ewers. He did beat Jalen Milroe. I kind of always hate when people say that though, because they're obviously playing. They're playing each other's defenses, not each other. But Jalen Milroe is red hot as anybody got. Heck, he outplayed Carson Beck when they went head to head again. But you could put these quarterbacks in any order, and I'd believe it by the end of the season. Again, Carson. There's an outstanding shot. He's still number one just because of the talent and the team around him and the scheme. This is year 2. You look at what he did in just year 1 starting. Year 2 is usually where these guys really jump. But you could say the same thing about Jalen Milroe, although different scheme, a lot of different personnel around him. So, yeah, I would not disagree with any of these.
Feels like, I don't mean this in a bad way to Carson Beck, but it feels like he is a very safe pick at number 1. And I think from a statistical and from a passer standpoint, he is going to get better this year. But there's also a chance that some of the guys behind him on this list also could maybe pass him a bit in numbers. And Carson Beck's numbers were great last year, but it also would not surprise me if Jackson Dart, Brady Cook, Nussmeier, Nico, Jalen Milroe, if any of those guys finished first team All SEC this year. It's just a really good year for quarterbacks in the SEC, kind of like this list kind of hints at. But no quarterbacks in our top 5, Mike. But it is it's an interesting mix. At number 5, we have Kelvin Banks, the offensive lineman from Texas. At number 4, we've got Malachi Starks, the safety from Georgia. At number 3, we've got Luther Burden, the outstanding receiver from Missouri. Number 2, Will Campbell, the offensive lineman from LSU. And at number 1, James Pierce, the defensive end from Tennessee.
Yeah, again, a lot of beef up front on that line of scrimmage. Love to see that in the SEC. One thing, though, that I forgot to ask you leading up to this, and I'll just ask you now, fair or not. If Caleb Downs was still in the SEC, how high would he rank on this list?
Top 5 for sure. I was thinking, which I'd probably have Starks probably. He would be right there with Starks somewhere, I think. Don't you think so? Like 4 or 5 maybe?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I would put him right in that range as well. But I don't know that again. Let's not spend a ton of time on him. He's not in here anymore. But let me ask you this because this just came to mind. Again, I'm not disputing any of this, Stephen, because pass rusher, as disruptive as a force as there is in football, and that's why left tackles like Will Campbell are so valuable because they have to stop those guys. So I'm looking at just specifically your top 3. Pierce, Campbell, Luther Burden. If you had one game to win and you needed the one guy, is that the order you're taking them in? Or because again, I know this is a different kind of question, but you got one game to win. You're missing one player. Who is that? Who is that your top candidate there?
Man, that's a really good question. At first I was going to say I would probably just take James Pierce because he's an edge rusher, defensive end. He could create some havoc. But then again, I thought, well, if I had Luther Burden, I could get him the ball in special teams. I could play him as a wildcat quarterback. I know I'm going to throw him the ball like 10 to 15 times. It's almost like Pierce could have like 3 to 5 really, really good splash plays where Burden could have like 15 to 20 like really solid touches, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. I mean, I hate to just like dismiss an offensive tackle, but I might go Luther Burden 1 and James Pierce 2 in that question debate.
Yeah, I think I would too, for kind of what you're hinting at there. But just you basically, I guess you could say it for James Pierce too. But the entire game, you'd have to know where Luther Burden is at all times, and he could just. I think he can affect the game in so many ways. Where again, James Pierce can as well, but he can also. Pierce could be non-existent for a quarter or two.
Right.
Whereas that's hard for me to imagine Luther Burden is unless he's just not on the field for whatever reason. So, most impactful perhaps Luther Burden, but I mean, that's classic offseason. I'm so tired of offseason discussions, Stephen. I'm ready for the college football. It's right around the corner. And man, this is getting me fired up for it, though.
I can imagine the dread that Mike has every time that he opens that email on Sunday from me saying, here are some potential show topics for this week. And it's more preseason stuff. Although it's about to run out. So I know you're probably I'm with you, man. As much as I love the offseason, love the preseason build up. It's like we're one of those coaches is like we've been hitting our teammates now for months. We're ready to hit somebody else. We're ready to have actual games to talk about and to analyze and be ready to talk about what it means for 3 weeks down the road. It's almost here.
Yep. Well, Stephen, I think that's a great place to cut this one. You got any last words before we jump off the line?
Apologize for the illness. Apologize for not feeling well tonight, but wanted to come hang out with the cousins and talk some SEC ball, try to raise the spirits. So just appreciate everybody watching, listening, and always interacting.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we appreciate you, Stephen, for soldiering on here. It's fall camp for us, too. And another outstanding show. Thanks to all the hard work you're doing behind the scenes to give the cousin's something a little bit significantly different than cousin Shane and I. So we appreciate all the hard work you do. Appreciate you showing up, and we appreciate each and every one of you for hanging out. We'll catch you on the next one.